So capitalism, argued Marx and others, is a remarkably progressive system in the sense of inducing investment, increasing production, and so on. But the advent of capitalism in Western Europe did not immediately lead to an industrial breakthrough or even a distinctly sharp rise in per capita GDP. That had to wait till the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century. So capitalism emerges in the 15th century or so, okay, but 16th century, there's a gap of about 200 years between growth of capitalism, okay, and Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century. Yeah, you see, merchants have always been important. You see, there's a lot of trade in. I can't shout. I'm tired. Please don't do it. Yeah. So, you know, trade was always there. Okay, even ancient societies' economies traded. Okay, and there was not just trade, but long distance trade. Of course, what capitalism does is to increase the size of trades or markets, and it makes trading more and more and more common. Okay, so it increases the size of trading in scale, okay, in its geographical reach and so on. In fact, some people argue that what we had between the breakup of feudalism and the beginning of capitalism is an intervening period of about 200 years, okay, where feudalism was, when feudalism gave way to a system of petty producers, okay, large number of people who owned their tracts of land, produced on it, consumed and also sold in the market. And that capitalism actually came into being by dispossessing these petty producers from their land. Okay, for example, classic case is conversion of sheep walks into private lands in England, okay, where common grazing lands were simply converted, snatched, taken away by force, by power, by a group of people, and converted it into their private property. So similarly, I mean, the enclosures movement in England, okay, so dispossession of people did play an important role in the origin of capitalism. Someone like Irfan Habib also, for example, have you heard his name, Irfan Habib? Any historian here? Yeah? Historian? Any student of history? So, have you heard the name of Irfan Habib? Okay. Very good. So, you know, he, for example, also subscribes to this view that feudalism did not immediately give way to capitalism. It created a system of petty producers, okay, small producers who performed labor and also owned means of production. Okay, that's how petty production is different from capitalism. Okay? In capitalism, those who perform labor do not own means of production. But whatever the historical sort of record, you know, the breakdown of feudalism did not immediately give way to either to capitalism or to industrial revolution. Okay, and even when it did give way to capitalism, okay, you know, it did not immediately yield results in terms of either higher industrial or, for that matter, growth of overall output. capitalism is definitely older than 1700. Okay, and look at the overall per capita GDP growth between 1700 and 1820 is just 20.4%. It's not per annum. It's 20% growth in per capita GDP registered over 120 years from 1700 to 1820. Okay, in Western Europe. In Asia, it was just 1.6%. Okay, so, and then compare it with 1820 to 1900. Okay, the next 80 years, 148%. Okay, so capitalism does not immediately increase growth rates. Okay, or does not immediately result in industrial transformation. Okay, that begins to happen only towards late 18th century and so on. Okay, capitalism as a system is older. I mean, even if you take into account the intervening period of 200 years and so on. So, by the way, look at the period 1950 to 2000. Asia is growing faster than Western Europe. Some amount of catching up is happening. So important changes in the rural scene and agriculture preceded the Industrial Revolution. And most important of them was that agriculture came to be organized as a capitalistic activity, okay, where you had incentive to increase output, to increase productivity, and that is something that breakdown of feudalism, okay, which created disincentive for investment on land, okay, which creates disincentive for raising yields and productivity, ultimately did. Arthur Lewis was a Jamaican economist. He got a Nobel Prize in economics. Okay, he was a great development economist, and he had this explanation for why Great Britain was the first country to industrialize. He said the distinguishing feature of Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century is that it began in the country with the highest agricultural productivity, Great Britain. Okay, so capitalism did not immediately lead to industrial transformation or high growth rates. In the early stages of its history, its attention was focused on agriculture, okay, increasing agricultural yields, increasing agricultural productivity, organizing agriculture as a capitalistic activity. And without agriculture, industry is not possible. Why? Because industrial workers have to be fed, okay? But food is not produced in factories. It is necessarily a product of land, of agriculture. And therefore, agricultural sector has to increase its productivity, has to generate a surplus over and above its own requirements so as to satisfy industry's demand for wage goods, for consumption goods, for food and so on, but also for raw materials of different kind. Okay? So, therefore, agricultural growth is necessary. Some may say even a precondition for sustained industrial growth. You agree with me? Okay. So, agriculture in Britain, when it came to be organized as a capitalistic activity, produced increased productivity, generated surplus, and therefore also supported industrial transformation within England by satisfying industry's demand for raw materials, by satisfying the demand in urban areas for food and so on. But if you look at the, you know, this period from 1820 to 1900, where Western Europe had about 150% growth in per capita GDP in 80 years, this was not a period of rapid human development or of much human development. In fact, some would argue any human development. Okay, that is why sane kind of analysis is very important. You cannot entirely focus on growth, material production, and so on. Okay, you also need to look at human beings, what is happening to them. And even in 1900, this is just by way of illustration, UK had a life expectancy of 50 years. Okay, so after so many years of high growth, okay, even in 1900, an average person in United Kingdom would live for just 50 years. Okay, and remember, UK's per capita income in 1900 in real terms would not be very far away from India's per capita income today. I have a feeling they would be roughly comparable. We are about 110 years behind. So, but our life expectancy has increased above 50, way above 50. It has crossed 60. In some centers, it is already 70. So you can do a lot by way of human development, even without getting growth. And I think this point gets re-established here. Yes, but that happens towards you're right, you need some amount of medical knowledge, okay, for reduction in mortality and so on, okay, some knowledge of disease, of how it works, how to control it, and that begins to happen only by the end of the 19th century, okay, you're right. So accumulation of medical knowledge begins towards the end of the 19th century, but it is not just medical knowledge that matters, okay? Poor sanitary conditions. People coming to urban areas without any understanding of how urban areas are to be planned, very poor sanitary conditions, okay? Not just that, low incomes, okay, for majority, inequality, okay? So, and rigors of factory-based work, long hours. You see, capitalism of the 19th century was a very different animal. Okay, people did not have rights. You did not have, for example, an 8-hour working day. People would work 12 hours, 16 hours. Okay, live in slums. Okay, which are overcrowded with poor sanitary conditions, and then die early. Okay, most of the legislation against use of child labor, for example, is a product of either late 19th or early 20th century. So children would start working, people would start working at very early age, okay, and then die early, okay. So industrial revolution, although it increased GDP, it resulted in expansion of material production, did not immediately translate into improvements in human well-being, okay. That had to wait for another 100-120 years for superior medical knowledge to sort of accumulate, to come forth, and for improvements in the conditions of labor generally, okay. Greater labor rights, okay. The rise of labor-based parties, okay. Strive for democracy, okay. All these were important. Okay, so the point is, okay, so so that's an important point that you should keep in mind when studying any historical experience, especially, by the way, for example, if you've read Charles Dickens, okay, this is something that comes out in his work, okay. Very poor living conditions in urban Europe of the 19th century, Paris of the 19th century or London of the 19th century. So capitalism did not immediately translate into greater industry, greater output, greater GDP, especially in industrial sector. There was a period in which capitalism first transformed agriculture, generated sufficient surplus from agriculture. That surplus was then used to feed workers in urban areas and industrial areas. And even when industry came into the scene and industrial revolution happened, that did not immediately translate into improved human well-being in Europe. Okay? So that's the point I'm making. So some main points just to reiterate. The main driver of growth is investment of surplus. Capitalism, unlike economic systems before it, is characterized by investment of surplus and growth. Okay? By the way, there are various reasons why, just as capitalism has growth built into its DNA, there are various reasons why something like a feudal system is inimical to growth. Okay? Take, for example, the kind of landlordism that emerged in India in the 19th century. Okay? What did that landlordism do? It resulted in rack renting. Okay? Tenants had no right on land. They were tenants at will, could be thrown out at the will of the landlord. Okay? Rents were kept very high, and tenants got a very small share of output. Okay? Barely enough for them to survive. Okay? And it left them with little resources, not insufficient resources to invest on improvement of land. On the other hand, landlords did not have the incentive simply because they were making money by extracting heavy rents. Okay? So the entire system worked as a disincentive towards improvement of agriculture. Okay? There's an economist called Amit Bhaduri. He was my teacher. And he surveyed villages in Bengal and argued that feudal relations in Bengal agriculture have hampered the growth of that agriculture. And he argued that it happens for the following reason. That you have a system of sharecropping. You know what is sharecropping? Okay? You have a landlord who's the landowner, and you have tenant. Okay? The tenant is compulsorily required to part a share of his output and give it to the landlord. Okay? Usually the rule is 50-50. 50 goes to the sharecropper, 50 goes to the landlord. People from Eastern UP and Bihar would know of this very clearly because it's a practice that still prevails in that part of the country. It's called Bataidari. Have you heard of it? Bataidar? Yeah. So, now, what did it do? Why was that system inimical to growth of agriculture? For the following reason. That suppose, okay, that most landlords were also oppressive money lenders. Okay? There were people who would lend money to their tenants at very high rates of interest. Okay? Now suppose the landlord introduces a new technology, output goes up, income of both the tenant and the landlord goes up. But the tenant uses his higher income to repay his debt to the landlord, escapes the debt trap, and reduces landlord's income from money lending. Okay? And the landlord therefore felt that it is in his best interest to not improve the productivity of land, to not invest on land, because if I invest on land, output goes up, income of my sharecropper also goes up, he repays my debt and escapes debt bondage. Okay? I cannot earn much income then from money lending. What is more, his children, his wife, his brother will not be available for work on my farm at low wages. Okay? So there are various ways in which a system that is not organized along capitalist lines, especially organized along feudal lines of the kind that I've just discussed, is bad for growth. Okay? Is this clear? Okay? And similar concern was expressed by classical authors long back, before Ricardo, Marx, so on, came into the scene, came into the picture. Classical political economy was dominated by a school of thought called physiocracy. Okay, physiocrats. And French physiocrats, for example, I'm forgetting his name. Quesnay. Perhaps it was Quesnay. But I don't know if this quote is from him. Okay, I've forgotten where I took this quote from. So, but he said, in France, sharecropping prevails. This is an old form of agricultural production derived from the feudal period, which either does not yield a surplus or the surplus is too small to be reinvested in production. The sharecroppers are poor and do not have the means to invest in modern capital equipment and in modern techniques of cultivation. In England, agriculture is developed and has high productivity, both per unit of land and per worker. Okay, so comparing capitalist mode of production, a capitalist system, with a more traditional, more feudal-based system of production called sharecropping, and you are arguing that, well, capitalism is more congenial for growth, for improvements in productivity. So, before industry can stand and develop, you need some improvements in agriculture, and therefore, one basic premise of strong industrialization drive is transformation of agriculture itself. Okay, this is a lesson that comes in that development policy makers, development economists have learned after so many failed attempts. Okay, in Africa, especially in Latin America, and in India. So, but I'll come to those later. Okay, but while transformation of agriculture is important for industrial growth, I want to argue that no economy can develop, no economy can grow on a sustained basis on the basis of agricultural growth alone. Okay, so you need to stand on two legs. One leg is never enough. First, why is it that countries that are richer are also usually the ones that have industrialized in the past? One argument is, at higher income levels, okay, this argument is called Engel effects. Okay, Engel is not Marx Engels Engel. Engel is a German statistician. And what is Engel effect? Engel effect says that as your income increases, you spend smaller and smaller proportion of your income on agricultural goods. So your consumption basket diversifies. Okay, pattern of demand changes. You want to spend less on agriculture, more on industry. And these demand side patterns would influence the structure of production, okay, away from agriculture towards industry. Okay, so industrialization, a changing structure of production away from agriculture to industry, is in some sense a reflection of changes in consumption patterns as people become richer. Secondly, as technology develops, synthetic substitutes for goods that were earlier produced in agriculture also develop. Okay, so plastic bags, for example, replace jute bags. Plastic is a product of industry, jute is a product of agriculture. When plastic replaces jute, industry replaces agriculture. Okay, and finally, by the way, these are just some of the arguments. I'll talk about more such issues when we discuss colonialism and the origins of international division of labor. Third argument, which comes most notably from Adam Smith, is that industry is the site of specialization and division of labor. Okay, I have not discussed Adam Smith yet, but let me just give you a sense of what he was trying to say. Smith's argument was that, he wrote this famous book called Wealth of Nations. He argued that wealth of nations, okay, or riches of a country depend on degree of specialization and division of labor. And degree of specialization and division of labor depends on the size of market. Okay? Greater is the size of market, greater is production. Okay? But greater is production, greater is the possibility of dividing labor into different tasks, assigning different tasks to workers, and then let them specialize in these different tasks. Okay? This way, you will be able to reduce costs. If a worker does the same thing again and again and again and again and again, dexterity will improve, productivity will improve, you'll become better at what you do. Okay? And that will be the basis of reducing costs. But it is also, cost is just the inverse of productivity. It will also mean that people will produce, each individual will produce more, because each individual has in fact become better at doing that particular, doing the assigned task. So, but if you have to increase productivity, if you have to sort of specialize, and if you have to benefit from specialization and division of labor, you need market. You need to produce. The more you produce, the better you become at producing what you're producing. Okay? Why? Because at large scale production you can specialize, okay, right, and divide, okay, or rather divide and specialize, okay, and this becomes the basis of improvements in productivity. By the way, Smith was an intelligent man. He also believed that that if people do the same task again and again and again, they will become stupid. Okay, so but nevertheless, this is required for improvements in productivity. So, and it is industry, okay, where which is really the site of specialization and division of labor. Okay, some amount of specialization of and division of labor can proceed to a certain extent in agriculture, but not beyond it. But in industry, application of scientific methods and of both scientific methods and of specialization of division of labor is more possible. Okay. So therefore not agriculture alone. Okay. For three reasons, at least three reasons. There are many more. Engel effects. Higher income levels, people spend a smaller share of income on agricultural goods, including food. So changing structure of production is simply a reflection of changing structure of demand or consumption. Over time, as technical knowledge accumulates, synthetic goods replace agricultural goods. Okay. And then finally, industry is the site of technological change as well as specialization and division of labor. So for these reasons, usually you find that countries that are more developed also have a higher share of industry in their output. And similarly, countries that are in the process of development typically rely more and more on industry and less on agriculture. Yeah, I'll take some questions now. Okay. So first of all, the share of both industry and services has increased at the expense of agriculture in India. Secondly, you see, services has a very fluid character, okay, and a very disparate character. You know, services would include software engineers in Pune, okay, or in Bangalore, okay, would include highly paid bank employees in Gurgaon and Bombay, okay. And it would also include Anna, you know, the person who sells tea, okay, the person who also, you know, who sells cigarettes next to him, okay. So usually countries that are very poor but do not have sufficient employment opportunities either in industry or in agriculture, people tend to become a part of services sector. I have nothing to do. What do? I become a fruit vendor. Okay. If I do not have the capital to start my fruit business, I'll become a shoe shine boy in front of Taj Hotel. Okay. So, you know, services sector, it's an all-encompassing category. It includes everyone. It includes me, who's a reasonably well-paid person, and it includes all kinds of people. It includes people who earn incomes that are much higher than me, and it also includes people who earn nothing at all, barely earn their subsistence income. Okay, so why? Because services sector is the employer of last resort. Okay, that is why the share of services has really shot up. Share of industry, it has grown. Okay, but if you look at structure of Indian economy and compare it with, let's say, actually, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Growing share of services is a worldwide phenomenon. But let's take countries in the developing world that have succeeded in the last few years, okay, in the last few decades. Let's take China. Okay, China has a much higher share of GDP coming from originating in industry compared to India. Okay, so we have usually the path of transition is from agriculture to industry to services. Okay, take the United States. It is also, you know, it's the largest services exporter in the world. Okay, it has also moved away from industry to services. Okay, but what are their services? They design chips, semiconductor chips. Taiwanese produce it. Okay, so at very high levels of income, you will find a very high share of services. Okay, especially due to research and development, okay, development of new technologies, which lies entirely within mostly within the services sector. Okay, they do not produce. Okay, look at middle income countries. Okay, take China. Okay, just now a middle income country. Very high share of industry. Okay, people have moved out of agriculture into industry. Services are large, but not as large as compared to, let's say, the United States. And then you have poor countries like India, where people have moved out of agriculture, okay, because agriculture has not been very dynamic. It has not proved very dynamic. Industry has not grown to a sufficient extent. So all these people have joined the services sector. Okay. Yes, but that used to be much higher. Okay, that used to be much higher. The share of industry has fallen all the way from 80% to 50%. So people have moved out. Okay, industry has grown, but has not grown at a sufficient rate to absorb all these people. Plus, technological improvement in industry has also kept these people out of industrial employment. So they've all gone and joined the services sector. That shows up in higher output of services sector, as well as higher employment within the services sector. Okay. Yes, yes, self-employment, because you see, people take to self-employment when they don't get a reasonably well-paying salary-based work. Okay, when do you start a pawn shop, for example? Okay, or when do you start a tea stall? Okay, usually it happens when you have no other options. बेटे को कुछ काम नहीं मिला, पान की दुकान खोल देते हैं. You know, it's a very common, और चाय की दुकान खोल देते हैं. It's a very common thing in India. It contributes to, forget about economy. People have to sustain themselves. Okay, they will obviously do something to sustain themselves, right? If nothing else works. So, yes. So they look for jobs in the services sector. It's not necessarily a good thing, self-employment, because it means lack of employment opportunities elsewhere. People, also in the services sector, take a vegetable vendor, for example. Okay? You take your thela from one place to another. It's a very difficult job, and then you're completely unsure about how much you're going to earn. You stand in sun for 16 hours. And at the end of the day, you have earned only $80 or $100 or $150. Okay, which is so, and you're standing, but nobody comes to buy vegetables. So there's a lot of disguised unemployment, a lot of wastage of effort. Okay, so yeah. No, it's an outcome of inability to find jobs elsewhere in the economy. What sort of an expression of individual freedom is that when I become a shoe shine boy? That you ask the government. One of my friends called it the impossibility of regrowing tails. Okay, that cannot happen. Okay, you're talking about people spending money on organic food. I don't know who does that. I'm sure there are people who do it. But people are also spending money on computers. Okay, on expensive mobile phones, on television sets. Okay, the kind of people you're talking about who eat organic food also buy Apple laptops and iPhones and iPads, right? So I don't know. I'll take her question. That is true. Agreed. But you see, how much can you eat? Can you keep eating? There will be. Yes, but how much? Your need of food will end. Your need of food will end because beyond a point, world economy is going to depopulate. Population is going to fall. Absolute size of the number of people on earth are going to fall. Okay? Not now, but 50, 60, 70 years, 80 years, 100 years from now. Okay? And believe me, you can't keep eating. Okay, it's impossible. You can't keep eating. How much can you eat? Okay, it's not healthy. Okay, more than anything else. So, therefore, there will be some transition away from agricultural consumption towards some other form of consumption. You know, Indians used to spend more than 70% of their consumption expenditure on food and related items, I think even in the 1980s, if I'm not wrong. Now it has fallen to close to 50%. It's a well-recognized well-recognized economic fact. Yeah, one more question and then I go back. But I should take questions. I have been hearing some. Yes. Yes, I agree with you. But you're right. You know, no. There is some amount of demand for specialized agricultural goods. You know, you can make an exotic salad. So you move away from agriculture one step forward, okay, in the processing chain, and then export it, okay. But how much salad? How much salad can people eat after all? So. And is agriculture a completely environment-friendly activity? Tell me. So, yeah, one question. This side of the... No? Okay, now I can't take more questions, please. No, yeah, okay. No, I don't know. I mean, I'm not too sure if I've understood your question correctly. But, you know, for example, eating out. Okay? Eating out was very uncommon even when I was a child or even a teenager. Okay? And now it has become common for a section of population. Okay? At least for a section of population, it has become common. But as soon as you eat out, that contributes to the growth of services sector. You know, because when you eat at home, that's not a part of services sector. It's a household-based activity. Okay? But once you move out of the household and eat out, you know, you go to hotels, restaurants, and so on, output of restaurants is, or income of restaurants is part counted as your GDP. So, you know, services sector growth might be some sort of an illusion. Okay? Because people are simply eating out and not eating at home. When they eat at home, it's not considered a part of services sector output or services sector GDP. But when they start eating out, it is. So I think, yeah, that might be the case. But not industry. I did not get the point about industry. Services. Yeah, but when you go out and eat, what gets displaced that is eating at home, not consumption of some industrial good. Or, you understand? Okay. All right. So there are reasons to believe why industry should grow in importance as you become richer. All right. Now, one more point that I wish to talk about before I move to my next lecture, and this is this is regarding the role of the state. That in the process of industrialization, in the process of transformation of the economy, what role, how much role is the state supposed to play? Usually people make one or two at a time. What time is it? 5:10. I'm going very slow. Okay, so no more questions. Usually people have this confusion that people confuse between capitalism and markets. Okay, markets are important, but capitalism is not market. It is not something that has or will ever, okay, grow purely on the basis of private initiative, private activity. Okay, state has always played an extremely important role in developing capitalism. Okay, one such view came from I can call him a classical economist. Actually, he was a historian, not an economist. His name was Alexander Gerschenkron. Alexander Gerschenkron, Gerschenkron, Gerschenkron. And he compared various cases of industrialization. Okay, and his first such comparison was between England and Germany. He argued that England is, when it grew, okay, it had no competitors, okay, and therefore it could grow at its own pace, okay. But for latecomer economies, economies that were following England, that option of growing at your own pace did not exist. Okay, if you do not grow fast enough, you will be consumed by England. Okay, so you have to catch up. There's a pressure to catch up. So you have to grow at a faster rate. And Germans, when they arrived on the scene, they at a faster rate than England. And from there he concluded, and he found that pace of industrialization was that Germans used banking and bank finance, okay, as an instrument for increasing the pace of industrialization. That firms are small, okay, early phases of development, but they have to grow at a very fast rate. So you inject capital or inject finance from outside in the form of banking by creating banks, okay, so that firms grow at a higher rate. So German industry, okay, German firms relied on banking to a much greater extent than English firms. Okay, but when he considered the case of Russia, he found that in Russia, banks, when it started industrializing, okay, banks were not sufficient. Okay, Russia did not even have, you know, class of interested capitalists who wanted to invest in industry and so on. So you needed state to turn into a capitalist, okay, or support industry in other ways. All right. So much of the railway construction that happened in Russia in the 19th and the 20th century happened because of heavy investment by the state. Okay, because Russia was speeding up its industrialization. Okay, the state itself became a capitalist or aided private capitalists in directly or indirectly in other ways. So from this, Gerschenkron concluded, the more underdeveloped a country, greater is the role of state in development process. Okay, state has to invest to increase the growth rate. But therefore, if you look at instances of industrialization in the post-Second World War period, you know, countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, okay, successful industrializers of the post-war period, they relied heavily on state intervention in a variety of ways. Okay, not only did state create infrastructure, it intervened heavily in the banking system. Okay, certain industries were favored. Okay, banks were forced to lend money to these industries. Okay, industries were subsidized. Trade was controlled and regulated. Okay, trade was highly controlled and regulated, and this was the case not just in fact, post-war instances of development. This has historically been true. Okay, England became an advocate of free trade only in the 1840s. Okay, after it became the most developed, the most industrialized country in the world, because it was certain that if trade is to be opened up, okay, if countries trade with us, okay, then we will benefit. We will benefit because no one is in a position to challenge our supremacy. And England's call for freeing up trade in the 1840s and 50s did not find response, for example, from the United States. The United States continued to impose heavy tariffs on imported goods because it wanted to develop domestic industry. Okay, and in fact, one historian called Paul Byrock has called US was the mother country and bastion of protectionism. It did not believe in free trade and free markets. It believed in protection, protecting its own industry from foreign competition. Why? Because at low levels of development, because or as you know, okay, let's look at the earlier bullet. Frederick List, another classical author, believed that competition can only take place between countries at similar levels of development. How can there be competition between Ghana and the United States? No competition, no possibility of competition. Okay, it will be a rout, no competition. So that is why you need protection. You do not necessarily have to open up trade, free markets if you want to industrialize. In fact, most successful cases of industrialization are those where state intervened and intervened heavily to impose tariffs. You know, for example, even if you look at England, till about 1840s, 1830s certainly, in fact, I mean, well after Industrial Revolution started, and Industrial Revolution, early phase of Industrial Revolution, was about development of textile industry. Okay, now, who is this? I'm tired. No, don't do this. Yeah, it was focused on development of textile industry, but England did not free the trade in textiles. Okay, it continued to impose heavy tariffs, import taxes, etc., on import of tariffs. In fact, England was not the most advanced part of the world industrially, even till the beginning of the 18th century. Okay, English people relied heavily on imports of cotton from India and silk from Persia. You know, English state wanted to develop textile industry at home. You know how did they respond? By banning imports of cotton textiles from India. Banning, no imports would be allowed, so that you develop industry at home. So state intervention in various forms, disrupting the free play of market forces, has been a very common ingredient of development policy in the past, and I see no reason why it should continue to be an important ingredient of development policy today. This is something that we learn from classical authors like Frederick List and so on. So I think I'll end this lecture here and move to the next lecture quickly. Okay, so far we have looked at development of capitalism and internal efforts to develop capitalism and its impact on agriculture and industry in advanced parts of the world. Okay, but the history of capitalism from very beginning is international. It's international. Okay, capitalism is not entirely a closed system. Okay, that is, it did not develop in Western Europe and subsequently in the United States and other parts of the world without affecting the development trajectory of other parts of the world, especially what are today considered developing countries. You see, most developing countries today were either directly or indirectly colonized at one point of time in their history. Okay? That does, of course, does not mean that, you know, what happened to us 100, 150 years ago or 200 years ago explains everything or every one of our problems today. But it did have a significant influence on our development trajectories. Okay. Okay, so just skip the. So development of growing disparities between nations was partly due to internal efforts of some of these countries to generate surplus and invest it. But an important factor that contributed to their industrialization was their control over surplus produced by other nations they subjugated. And colonies were not only a source of surplus, but also provided markets for goods produced in more advanced capitalist countries. So for England, markets and resources of Asia, Latin America, and Africa were available on tap. Okay? Moreover, resources exploited in these parts of the world provided surplus for industrialization in Europe's overseas offshoots. Okay? If you generate, you know, one country produces surplus. Indian peasants produce 100 kilograms of corn. Okay? Consume only 50 kilograms of corn. But the other 50 kilograms of corn is taken away by Britishers. Okay? So Britishers can either invest that corn within Britain or use that corn to invest for investment in other parts of the world. You know, most significantly, it happened in what are today called European offshoots in Australia, New Zealand, and most importantly, the United States. You know, much of don't do this, don't do this. Can't you lay still for 2 hours? Don't you have that much patience? You're all grown-ups now. Still. If you don't want to pay attention to what I'm saying, think. Reflect on other issues of importance in your life. But don't speak. You know, it disturbs me and it disturbs 3, 4, 5% of this gathering that might be interested in what I'm saying. So please don't do this. It's unfair. So it provided surpluses for investment not only in Britain but also for investment in the European offshoots. You know, England's industrialization of the United States in the 19th century. You know, for example, investment in US railways was to a very large extent financed by borrowings and other forms of capital flows from Britain. Okay, but Britain, which was investing capital in these countries, was also receiving capital in the form of tribute from its colonies. So it was a complicated pattern of trade and investment that emerged. And its European offshoots also helped. Europe to reduce its own dependence on land. Why? Because people were just simply sent out. People migrated. Okay, and that relieved the land constraint. Okay, if you have a given amount of land but too much population, that results in a land constraint. You know, how do people survive on a small amount of land? So how do you overcome the land barrier? By making people leave your country, settling somewhere else. Okay, and so the Britishers went and settled in Australia, in New Zealand, in United States, Canada, and other parts of the world. And okay, I'll come to this point later.